So good. See it, you
Oh,
can
I'm pausing this.
Felt like I was there.
Good. Good morning, friends. Welcome to our Bible study here at Chapel by the Sea Presbyterian Church on Fort Myers Beach. Our study is Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, Characters of the Bible. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, the interim pastor. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our study in person and online. So as we think about this, I want you to remember that we are talking about our faith family. Just like every one of us has a genealogy. We may not know it, we may know it, but every one of us has a family story. Well, part of our family story is our faith family. And these characters are the origins of our faith, the DNA of our faith. So we're going back to look at them and see what we can discern from them, what we can learn from their lives and their examples. Now, today's examples aren't really dramatic in the way some others are, but they are significant. Okay, today we are looking at what I call all in the family. We looked at Adam and Eve last week. This week, we're looking at the rest of the family. Cain, Abel, their kids, Seth, and we'll find out about some more that you've never heard of before. We're going to look at Enoch, and we're going to look at the children of Lamech. And I'll tell you why those are significant as we go forward. So first of all, Adam and Eve, they have two sons, Cain and Abel, initially. And so we have the beginning of the Holy Family, the human family. And Cain and Abel are raised up and loved by their parents. Now, they've been cast out of Eden, so they are now living on their own in the world. And what we are told is that as Cain and Abel grow up, Cain becomes a farmer, Abel becomes a herdsman. Hold phone, pause the picture right there. What does that tell you? We're back at the beginning. We speak of it as the beginning of time. This story is an allegory. It's not literal. Now, here's why I say that. These are like the second and third people in the universe. And yet, there's developed agriculture. There's developed animal husbandry. Where did all this come from? He didn't just walk out and remember, in Eden, the land gave its fruit willingly. When they got cast out, now that it yields its fruit grudgingly. So somehow, Cain had to learn how to be a farmer. He had to learn the cycle of seeds, plants, save the seeds, eat the rest, replant the following year. That didn't happen overnight. That's why I say this is an allegory. This also tells us, those two words tell us when this took place. Find out in a minute. Okay, birth order factor. Where do you fall in the birth order factor? I'm the eldest son, second child, eldest son. And while I was in seminary, I remember one day in a class we were taking, the professor told us that among ministers, there is a disproportionate number of eldest sons. Eldest sons tend to be doctors, ministers, and I think he said therapists. And disproportionately so. So this is like 1972 or 73. And the seminary class has like 2-3 women in it. Nowadays, it's more than 50% are women, but then it was unusual. And so as he's talking about this, one of the students goes, wait a minute. How many in this room are eldest sons? 99% of us raised our hands. And it was like, whoa, baby. Yeah, birth order factor does play a role. Cain's the eldest, Abel's the younger. Now, did your parents ever have a favorite when you were kids? Remember Tommy and Dickie Smothers? We're old enough to remember the Smothers brothers. And remember one of the routines was mom always liked you best. Did your parents have a favorite? Did you envy anyone as a child? These are the emotions that are going to flow into our story today. Because remember, I said last week, the difference between innocence and virtue. Innocence means you've never had to choose. But once the choice is in front of you, you have to choose right or wrong. Choosing right is virtue. So that's what the story hinges on. Cain and Abel bring offerings to God. Cain brings up grain from his field, offers it to God, it's a burnt offering, and God's not pleased. Abel brings a lamb from his herd, offers it to God, and God is pleased with his offering. And Cain's upset. Cain starts harboring, starts seething with anger, and God says to him, do what is right. Sin is crouching at your door, but you must master it. So this is a tall order for this young guy, and his anger is growing, but he doesn't suppress it. So let me ask you this. Does your anger have a long fuse or a short fuse? Cain's, and even that is a misnomer. In anger management, one of the things they taught us was the person who blows up and punches out his boss and gets fired didn't get angry in that moment. The anger started way back at the beginning of the day, and it wasn't dealt with and kept building and building and building as time went on. Anger management teaches the person to deal with their anger back at the beginning, not when they're ready to explode. Cain didn't deal with it. In the book of James, we're told that sin doesn't just pop out all of a sudden. It begins with an idea, then it's harbored in your heart, and you nurture it and keep it going until finally it bursts forth full-blown as sin. Same idea. So he calls his brother and says, let's go out to the field together. And when they get out there, Cain kills his brother Abel. Gruesome story. And God comes along later on and he says, Cain, where is your brother? And he says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? This is one of the questions of our world today. Am I my brother's keeper? And what God is saying to us is, yes, you are your brother's, your sister's keeper. So wearing our masks is being our brother's or sister's keeper. You know, wearing your seatbelt, not driving drunk, that's all being our brother's or sister's keeper, protecting them, taking care of them. So God says to Cain, what have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the soil. What is epic language? And what's God going to do? What should God do to Cain? Should he slay him? Well, at the same time that God is just and judges him, he's also merciful. So he doesn't slay him, but he condemns him to exile and to wander on the earth. And so we are told he went off and wandered in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The word Nod literally means the land of wandering. So where have you seen that term, east of Eden? Movie? The novel by John Steinbeck about two brothers. And the older one is the father's favorite, and the younger one's always trying to be good enough. It's a powerful story. He wanders east of Eden, and he says, my suffering is too great. God says, I will protect you. So even though God has judged him, he still protects him and cares for him. Now, what are Adam and Eve going to do? Well, Adam knows his wife again. She conceives and bears another son whom they name Seth, which means compensation. Now, let me tell you a personal story here. While I was in Alaska in 1988, my third son was born prematurely and died after 11 days. It's a traumatic year for us. A year or two later, family working with the Forest Service suffered I forget if it was stillbirth or a miscarriage just right at the end. Anyway, their child was born dead, and they were devastated. Somebody said, would you go talk to them? And I did. And as we talked about the pain and the grief, the sense of loss, and just your future being taken from you and all it will not happen. I told them this story that Eve bore another son to Adam and they named him Compensation, Seth. And so that was the end of the counseling session, prayer. A few months later, the wife becomes pregnant again. And this time at 6 months, they move her down to Virginia. We were in Southeast Alaska. They moved her to Virginia, near family, near a major hospital, major birth center. And this time the baby was born fine. And they sent word back through the person who had originally contacted me about going to see them. And she called me and said, oh, they had a baby boy. And they wanted me to tell you. Sorry. They named him Seth. Adam and Eve have Cain, Abel, and Seth. And then in chapter 5, we're given this subtle little comment, and many other sons and daughters. So here we're thinking that he just had 3 kids. No, man, they had a litter. They had plenty of kids. And from that, we find that's where humankind comes from. They're marrying each other. At that point, it's pure gene pool. So Cain marries, often east of Eden, and his wife has a son, and they name him Enoch. And Enoch is the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Lamech. Now, this line is important not so much for what they do as for who they are, just who they become. And this is why I want to tell you this. If we read carefully what's in the text, we can find information that's not immediately apparent to us. Lamech's children are Jabal, Jubal, Tubal-Cain, and Naamah. Nothing significant in and of itself. But then the text goes on to tell us, Jabal is the father of herdsmen who live in tents. So Bedouins, nomads, herdsmen. Jubal is the father of all who play the flute and harp. So he's the father of music and musicians. Tubal-Cain was a worker in bronze and iron. Now, I don't know, that conjunction of those 2 words, bronze and iron, is an oxymoron. You see, bronze was developed about 3000 BC, but we know that iron was much later. So Tubal-Cain is the father of the metal workers, but bronze and iron didn't coexist. The reason the Philistines could dominate the Israelites was because the Philistines knew how to smelt iron and had iron weapons, and the Israelites had bronze weapons. And the iron would just cut the bronze weapons in half. So that the power was in the iron. Okay, so that's just a little detail. But here's what it does. It tells us when they lived. Those little words accurately date for us when this part of the story takes place. How do we know? We know the domestication of sheep began about 6700 BC. Now, who did it say were keepers of sheep? Abel, Cain and Abel. Domestication of cattle comes about 700 years later, about 6000 BC. So that's Jabal and his group. So now we know that we're seeing that what we think of as the origin of humans is beginning about just after 7000 BC or BCE, before the Common Era. That's the current usage. Instead of just before Christ, we say before the Common Era. So about after 7000, we see the development of civilization, and these stories are written down, or passed down, I should say. These are all oral tradition. The smelting of iron doesn't develop until 1200 BC. So when we talk about Tubal-Cain, we're talking about a later development in biblical history. So when he talks about a worker of bronze and iron, it's saying he's much later. He's almost to the time of King David and Saul. David, it's easy to date David. He's 1000 BC. And that's kind of my pivot point. When I'm thinking about history of the Bible, 1000 BC, King David. Saul's before that, Solomon's after that. But all this stuff is taking place way back before the pyramids, before all that, in the early days of civilization in the far Middle East. So this is why I say when we read our Bibles, it pays to slow down and read the details. A worker of bronze and iron. Okay, that just pulled the timeline forward to match up with the Iron Age. And when he talks about one who keeps cattle and one who's agriculture, remember that doesn't happen on its own. Smelting iron does not happen over a campfire. That's an involved metallurgical process, and it involves a lot of different steps. And it involves a complex, sophisticated society to do that. The same with smelting bronze. It doesn't happen over a campfire. So when they talk about one who worked in metal instruments, one who makes musical instruments, you're talking about a well-developed society at that point. So if we think of this as, oh, they were back there, just straight out of the Garden of Eden, no, this is allegorical. The Bible doesn't have to be a textbook or a chronology straight out of the local newspaper's timeline. This part of the story is allegory, and it's existing to tell us to believe God, to trust God, and to follow God, because God has a plan and he's leading us forward. And all these characters are going to come together in next week's lesson when we look at Genesis 5 through 9. And that's what I want you to read for next week, Genesis 5 through 9. We're going to look at Noah and his family, the great flood, and the covenant, because that brings us a time of hope. But it's not a simple little story of, little critters going into a kid's toy ark and blah, blah, blah. There's a whole depth to that story that is heartrending as well as hopeful. So that's all in the family. That's how our families got started, was from these humble beginnings comes what we will see next as Noah and the stories of the flood and the stories of the covenant. Okay, any comments or questions you might have? And if you're online, leave us a comment on Facebook or on the church webpage. We'd love to hear from you. We'll get back to you, reply, and like us on Facebook or on like our YouTube channel. We want to hear from you, it's just like you want to hear from us. Okay, any comments from the room? Any questions?
I was wondering about, they keep referring to how many years people live.
How many years people live? 600 years on average.
And one was 90, and I thought that's more like today.
When I was a young minister, we had an extended recurring Bible study, and we kept a running list of questions I want to ask God. And we were up to 2.5 pages when it got lost one time and somebody moved and lost the list. That's one of the questions I want to ask God, which is also why I say we need to approach this as allegory, not as literal. What's important is not how could they have lived 600 years? The question is, were they faithful to God? What did they learn about God? What are they teaching us about God's faithfulness and love? It's easy to get bogged down in those kinds of details and miss the whole message that God's trying to say to us. Love me with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. I've often wondered about that, and each one of those generations that I talk about, Lamech's great grandson, 600 years apiece, it just seems far-fetched. Seriously, I don't have an answer for that. That's one of the ones I want to ask God when I meet my Lord face to face.
I think with Cain and Abel, the farming and you also have to have some kind of community too, because you get the sheep, then you've got to have
People to
sell the sheep, buy the feed, and agriculture, you know, raising crops.
Yeah, she's saying that in raising sheep or in agriculture, there's got to be a community to make that happen. There has to be a network of people. If you're raising sheep, who's going to do all the shearing? Who's going to blah 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 on and on with agriculture? Who's going to build a network necessary so that you have all the tools you need, the proper tools that you remember year to year what you're supposed to do. The community memory is important in those contexts because nothing's written down.
I often wonder if there was sort of God's family, and then there were maybe other people who, it's sort of like being Jews and Gentiles. And they did,
God's people here and other people over there.
and that they intermingle.
Well, you notice when Cain is being cast out, he says to God, your judgment is too great. There are people there who will kill me. Well, who are those people?
Yeah.
If you take it absolutely literally, I don't know. But if you take it as an allegory, it's obvious that there are other people already populating the earth. These are the beginning of the people that God's story, through whom God's story is told.
Especially when you get to Noah and how wicked the people were.
When we get to Noah next week and how wicked the people were, right? There was a lot of people, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get it gets really sticky next week with flood story, and
also, I know they had other wives, so when we get some of these people, they'll name certain people.
Yeah.
And then they'll say they had other sons and daughters, which I figured, well, maybe they married somebody that would not be considered part of God's family, and that's why they're not named.
maybe they had other wives that were not other people that were not part of God's family and were not named. I don't know, but I do know that this world's not ours. This world's very different from the one in which we live. And one of the things I try to remind myself is to not superimpose my worldview on 6,000 years ago, but to let it, or 6,000, 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BCE, so 8,000 years ago. I've got to let that world be itself and speak to me, rather than my trying to make it fit into my world, my format.
Last year,
You get what?
I can't even make last year fit into.
I can't even make last year fit into my world this year. Yeah, that's true. All right, friends, thank you for joining me today. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, and this is Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings from Chapel by the Sea Presbyterian Church on Fort Myers Beach. So please join us again next week as we continue with our study, as we look at Noah and the story. Read Genesis 5 through 9 for next week, and I'll see you at 10:30 next Tuesday morning. Thank you. Goodbye.
Did it look like only one was signed on to Zoom? Or what you saw?
Yeah.